Hello YouTube. So today I thought I'd try something a little bit different and show you some of my academic work. So many of you may know my name's Kyle Harrington. I've got a background in psychology, artificial intelligence and philosophy, though my current work is as a PhD researcher within the Human Factors Research Group at the University of Nottingham. Human Factors also goes under the name of ergonomics, and basically we take a human-centered approach to solving technical problems or technical social problems. So the focus of my PhD is really on how we can use technology to help find missing people. This presentation is called The User Requirements of Missing Person Search, and I presented it in a conference at 2016, although I've omitted some of the more technical aspects of the presentation. My work's made possible by the EPSRC Funding Council and Philips Research. So, what exactly is the problem? Well, people with care and support needs are much more likely to go missing than the average person, or are in fact at a much higher risk when they do. Those living with dementia, for example, represent only around 1% of the UK population, but account for 15% of all total search and rescue operations, so they are massively overrepresented. We also know that there's a problem of underreporting. Many missing person incidents don't get reported to the police, so we can't be entirely sure of the prevalence. People with dementia who become missing will often also leave very few physical clues as to their whereabouts, making it much harder for anyone trying to find them. And in incidents involving people with dementia who were found deceased after becoming missing, carers only contacted the police after a mean time of 3.5 days, so we know that there is a reluctance to call the police, and this can have a massively adverse effect on the outcome of search. We also know that the median distance for people travelling with dementia ranges from around 1.3 kilometres walking, but it can be as far as 400 kilometres by train. Applying the pi-r squared rule, it means you have a potential search area of around 500,000 kilometres squared. We know a lot about where people are found when the police find them, but we don't actually know what happens prior to police involvement, because the decision-making processes in missing person search activities are very hard to analyse and quantify. We have traditional experimental approaches, which tend to be looking at visual search, where a participant has to find a target item in an array of distractors, but of course this lacks the ecological validity and emotional salience of a real missing person search, and it also lacks the complexity of a real missing person search when there are numerous factors at play. The other approach tends to be statistical analysis of where people are found, but again this can only tell us so much, and the problem of underreporting means that there are quite a lot of incidents that we don't know very much about at all. But technology does have the potential to reduce the risk of people with care and support needs getting into trouble after becoming lost. Unfortunately, as mentioned before, very little work has been done to understand how these missing person incidents unfold, from the realization that the person is absent up until the time that people call the police. So really my focus is what are the needs and requirements of carers and relatives who conduct these informal missing person searches? What are the steps they take, and how might we assist them? So the general approach to my entire PhD looks something as follows. So I started out with a literature review and identified some aims and objectives. You can see there the purple is my main research question. How can technology assist for searching for vulnerable adults who are missing? To answer this question, I've designed 3 studies here on the left-hand side in the red boxes. I'm going to be talking about the cognitive task analysis today, although I've just completed my 2nd study and I'm just about to launch my 3rd. So, once I've completed all of these studies, I hope to write up a list of recommendations and, of course, arrive at some conclusions. So, as mentioned before, the first study is a cognitive task analysis, which is really a way to break down and represent complex decision-making in a real-world environment. So, I interviewed 5 carers, both formal, professional and paid carers, as well as informal familial carers, and that will be the subject of today's video. But I did also interview 5 search and rescue experts who had experience in searching for adults with care and support needs, and they make up the second part of this study. Perhaps at a future video I'll go into more detail about the findings from that study. So all of my participants were asked to describe in detail an incident from their own personal experience. And throughout the interview, the participants and myself identified critical decisions. These were things that had a profound effect on the outcome of the search and would have been made differently had circumstances have been different. Once these critical decisions were identified, I probed exactly how people arrived at these decisions using a series of probing questions. Interviews were conducted face-to-face and via Skype interview and lasted approximately an hour, with the longest one being around 2 hours and the shortest one around 45 minutes. The interviews were then transcribed and common decisions as well as pervasive themes were identified. So the whole process looked something like this. I started with the interviews, which were then transcribed and codified into timelines. I then codified the critical decision points as identified previously in the interviews. Once that had been done, I was able to analyze global themes, things that were pervasive throughout all of the incidents and indeed across all of the incidents. There's the matrix tabulation, which I'll get onto very shortly, a table of themes, which really kind of goes into slightly more detail about each particular decision, and finally a generalized timeline, which I'll show you very, very shortly, and I'll briefly discuss some of the conclusions from this work. So, what do people tend to do? Well, this is the generalized timeline. So first of all, people will search the very immediate vicinity, the position of last sighting, as it were, the place where the person's expected to be. Now, once they realise that the person is absent, not quite missing, but absent, people will tend to enlist help. Now, if they are a professional carer, this will be a peer or someone at their level. If they're a familial carer, it may be a family member or a spouse or a trusted friend. After that, they'll search the area nearby on foot, so this could be the local neighbourhood or a place close by that the missing person likes to go to. If they are a professional carer at this point, and only at this point, will they tell a senior member of staff. Finally, they'll conduct a wider search. Often this will be done in a car, but it does seem to me that this wider search is really just trying to exhaust all of the possibilities. It's almost a last-ditch effort before finally calling the police. So I'll just break down each of these particular decisions in slightly more detail here. So once I'd codified in the transcripts all the references to searching the immediate vicinity, I sorted out all the reference into general groupings, which you can see here, these sub-themes. The numbers here represent how many references in the complete transcripts were actually referencing these particular sub-themes. So people like to rule out the obvious places. They start to make inferences as to the person's whereabouts. They start to notice raising levels of anxiety. And at this point as well, they start to consider the health issues that the missing person might have. The next decision is enlist help. So people will tend to enlist help not only for the physical and material assistance of actually conducting the search task. I needed someone to help me look because I couldn't be in two places at once. But they'll also do it for emotional support and emotional reassurance, because I was panicking. And I got this other person and said, I'm sure it's okay, but X is not in her room. Professional carers at this point may also be bound by policy and procedure. The next decision that people tend to make is search the nearby area on foot. And they do this by making reference to location and environment specific considerations. This person here says, I knew it would be closed, she's referring to a church, because of course they don't open until 11 o'clock. They make person-specific considerations. For example, he likes to stick to certain pathways. But they also at this point establish that the person is missing. they are no longer an absent person or a person that they isn't where they were expected to be, but at this stage the realization sinks in that the person may indeed be missing. At this point I thought, right, this isn't just him wandering off. People will initiate a wider search following this. Again, as if they are professional carers, they may have contacted a senior member of staff before this point. And to initiate the wider search, again, they make reference to the missing person and a knowledge of that missing person's past behaviour. They depend upon the assistance of others, but they are also trying to rule out possibilities and doubt. Finally, issues of responsibility start to come into play here. And the very last decision, which is the decision to call the police, is perhaps the most troubling to carers who have lost a person that they are caring for. So I've gone into slightly more detail with this one. You can see here that there's references to the transfer of responsibility, and carers were reluctant to hand over this responsibility and often felt helpless once the police had arrived. They also perceived calling the police as failing in their responsibilities as a carer. And it's certainly true that once the police are involved in a missing person search, they then become the principal decision makers in that search. This person says, you dial 999, and that's it. They have taken over. People also make reference to running out of other credible alternatives when they are arriving at the decision to call the police. People call the police when they feel that they've exhausted most of these options. They also felt that they needed to do this work before calling the police. I remember one of my participants actually said something like, she thought the police were going to ask her where she had looked before, and she wanted to provide some good answers. Attitudes towards the police were actually generally mixed. So some of the professional carers reported that the police might have seemed indifferent if that person had previously absconded from care, but other participants actually said that the police were very reassuring. There are also other barriers that stop people from calling the police earlier. As mentioned before, sometimes carers feel obliged to perform other search tasks. Others were reluctant because they didn't want to appear incompetent or be judged. Again, for professional carers, there may be procedural policies in place that dictate when a person calls the police. But sometimes these procedures were flaunted due to specific circumstances. One of my professional carers contacted the police earlier than the care recipient's care package would dictate, because she felt that it was a Friday night and that person was at additional risk. So when people are involved in these kind of situations, we can't simply just look at the policy and procedure and assume that people will behave in that way. Once all the critical decisions had been codified in this manner, I was able to look at what kind of things tended to pervade all of the incidents. So responsibility in the role of a carer. You can see here again the numbers tell you the kind of prevalence of these issues within the transcripts. So relationship and duty of care, respect for personhood, barriers and difficulties, and the carer's psychological needs. I'll go into this theme in slightly more detail. People also considered safety, well-being and risk. In particular, psychological vulnerability was very high on the list here. People start to consider the past behaviours of the missing person, as well as the physical conditions that this person may be living with. For professional carers, we also have issues of policy and routine, but we've also got issues of external risk, whether this is stranger danger, or a risk of falling, or a risk of being hit by a car, for example. Astral travelling and hypothesis generation is really a fancy way of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes as to make inferences about that person's whereabouts. And people do this by their knowledge of the missing person, situation-specific hypotheses, but there's also an issue with some of the care recipients that they perhaps may be hiding and avoiding search teams. People will also consider the very recent events and the mood of the missing person when deciding where to look. And this is particularly interesting for me, metacognition and confidence in decisions. Metacognition really refers to thinking about thinking, and it was very prevalent throughout all of the interviews. So we have issues of certainty and uncertainty, anxiety, regret and guilt. Sometimes people perceive a lack of alternatives, and the opposite of uncertainty, which is of course flow, that sense of being in the moment and not necessarily having to consciously think about your next action. There was also a few references to acceptable risk. And you can see here the relative prevalence of all these different themes. So the most referenced themes were hypothesis generation and metacognition, but you can see that there's a reasonably even split between all of them. So to go into some of the specific issues about safety versus autonomy, one of the very interesting things that I found about this was that carers often feel that they do have a duty of care to ensure this person's safety and well-being, but this is sometimes at odds with that person's respect for their autonomy. So, to delve a little bit deeper, relationship and duty of care really details that perceived responsibilities, the perceived responsibility of the carer to the care recipient, and the relationship the carer has with the care recipient. And the major considerations here are the protection of the care recipient from physical and psychological harm. However, some of the carers said that it would be impossible to completely reduce risk without denying this person a sense of autonomy, because often reducing this particular risk was closing this person's choices. For example, here, one of the carers says, "The difficulty was that it was his home she stressed, and I didn't feel able, certainly during the day, to lock the front door." So there is somewhat of a trade-off here. So there are other barriers and difficulties that carers face, including other responsibilities that they might have. Perhaps they care for other people, perhaps they have children, perhaps they have logistical problems or other time constraints and resource allocation problems. Carers also report feeling that they need to be supported or reassured in order to properly fulfill their duties and responsibilities. An interesting supporting quote here at the bottom is, "I suppose that's the point at which, you kind of want somebody to help and hold your hand a bit and say, it's okay, it'll be okay." So, I mentioned the matrix tabulation before, and essentially what this is I checked for all the references for each of the decision points, and I cross-referenced them with the global themes to give you an idea of the relative focus of the carer's thoughts as they work through each stage of the missing person search. So you can see that here. I've highlighted the most prevalent ones in the darker blue colour. So when people are searching the very immediate vicinity, their main focus is this idea of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. But again, as we shift to enlisting the help of a friend or a colleague, issues to do with responsibility in the role of a carer, as well as issues to do with metacognition, that doubt, anxiety, uncertainty start to creep in. When we start to get back to the more typical search tasks, searching around the surrounding areas on foot, we can see again the most prevalent theme is this astral travelling. But you can also see at this point that metacognition and confidence in decisions is quite high at this point as well. For the professional carers, again, when we tell the senior member of staff, people start to question their responsibilities, their duties, and their role as a carer. Next, when we start to look at searching the further areas in cars, you can see again this more typical search task generally involves putting yourself into the mind of another person. And finally, the decision to call the police, the two most common themes here were responsibility in the role of a carer and metacognition in decisions. And to me, this seems to make sense. It seems like those issues where we're dealing with talking to another person, or there's a potential to be judged. The themes that are most prevalent are metacognition and responsibility in the role of the carer. When people are doing the more traditional search task, they tend to do this hypothesis generation. So, a brief discussion of some of these findings. The information is actually based on real missing person searches from the perspectives of carers and experts. And as mentioned before, there is a considerable gap in the literature of what actually happens during these informal missing person search tasks prior to police involvement. A cross-tabulation of these global themes and critical decisions allows insight into what is important and when, which may help us to develop a system that will help people through the various stages of missing person search. But unfortunately, it is based on a very small sample size. And as such, there's not enough data to determine which factors affect which decisions. It's also based on retrospective accounts, which are subject to all kinds of bias, including hindsight bias and memory error. But the conclusions and take-home messages of this study are that informal missing person searches tend to follow an ordered sequence. Carers will often seek help both from material assistance and reassurance that they're doing the right thing. It's important to consider that these informal missing person searches aren't really done on an individual basis. One individual may take charge, but they tend to rely on more than one person conducting it. It's not a solitary endeavour most of the time. Metacognitive thoughts were pervasive across all of the decisions, and carers were often very uncertain about the best course of action. Calling the police is the most troubling issue for people engaged in informal missing person search tasks, but as mentioned earlier, a reluctance to call the police in a timely manner can have very adverse consequences for search outcomes. Often there is a playoff between the wish to respect the person's autonomy and the concern for that person's safety. So I am currently setting up a second study which hopes to address some of the issues to do with the very small sample size, but I hope you've enjoyed this presentation so far, and if you like it, I may do something very similar in the future. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Kyle Harrington, also known as the Mechanics of Thought, signing off. Peace.